readings of texts that you might think of as civic scripture. Grace Lee Boggs, Martin Luther King, Walt Whitman, Abraham Lincoln. There's a sermon. And what we've learned from Civic Saturday is this: character is contagious. It is wholly possible for everyone in this room to set off a cascade of civic character today by taking a stand or by taking a knee. We've learned, too, that character, like power, is infinite. It's infinite. When you put character into action, when you serve, when you sacrifice, when you risk your own capital and privilege to benefit those who are currently disfavored, when you challenge and confront the structural systemic inequities in our society that give lie to and betray our nation's creed, in short, when you show up for others, your moral core doesn't get spent and burned down and disappear like fuel. It increases. It expands with use, like imagination. It generates more of itself from itself, like art or like love. And that, in the end, is both the beauty and the burden of my little formula. P plus CH equals CI. We who are gathered here today, we know something about how to practice power. We know something about the cultivation of character. Take a good look at each other. Look around this room. We believe still, and we know that America is still possible. For love of country, then, let us circulate what we know. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Eric. It's so great to have his leadership in this space. Up next, we have two artists, two sons of hip hop, if you will, in conversation. The first is Lin-Manuel Miranda. I'm sure you've never heard of him, of course. It's the tiny musical he did called Hamilton. And we also have Common, who is a socially conscious rapper, who's known for his lyricism as much as his social justice work. Can we please give a warm welcome to Lin-Manuel and Common?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thanks, y'all.
Ladies and gentlemen, the C-O-double-M-O-N.
Yo, it's an honor to be up here with Lin, and I'm the C to the O-double-M-O-N.
Hey!
From the city of Win.
Woo! We have to be careful. This will become a rap concert if we don't stay on topic. I'm here with Chicago legend, Common, Maestro. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, brother. Thank you. I'm honored to be here with you. You're one of my inspirations.
That's a crazy thing to say.
You are. You are. I got to say, I mean, when you see a piece of art that's created that you feel like it's life-changing, you remember that moment. It's like the first time you heard Illmatic by Nas, one of the greatest hip-hop albums ever made.
5 stars, 5 mics.
And, you know, like when you first seen Do the Right Thing, certain things just affect your life where you're like, man, my life will never be the same. And it had that impact on so many people in our lives and in culture. And it was like eye-opening for me to see all these people from different walks of life being brought together to tell a story about a person prevailing through life and overcoming situations. It's amazing for me because out of the genius of your brain, you came up with this thought and correlated that to hip-hop, the story of Alexander Hamilton. And I'm not asking you a question, to be honest. I'm just letting you know how grateful I am and what this meant. But I will ask, during the writing of it, was it something important for you to put so many multicultural people, like to put all these different colors of people as these heroes in American history? Because that was one of the things that really opened my mind and heart.
Well, first of all, I want to make sure everyone's recording so I can watch that back later for when I'm old and gray. Yes, you know, I read Hamilton's story, and I got to the part where he wrote his way out of the Caribbean. I mean, talk about full circle. A hurricane destroys St. Croix. And Alexander Hamilton writes an account of the devastation he sees, and people take up a collection to get him off the island, to get his education on the mainland. That could not be more full circle than today. But I also thought, well, that's hip hop. Yeah. That's what I love about hip hop. It's about writing about your struggle so specifically that anyone can find their way into it, and anyone can find the universal within that particular struggle. And that's what inspired me about his story. And he kind of always does that. At every point, he writes his way into the next situation. And I'm glad I get to say this to you here. You know, the fun for me was in matching, not just in writing it as a musical, but also matching flows to what I thought the founders were. So, all right, Hamilton, he wants to be the smartest guy in the room. He's going to have all these polysyllabic rhymes. So he's the son of pun and Eminem. I'm patiently waiting, I'm passionately smashing, all that. But then for George Washington, so George Washington was like the only guy everyone could agree on as a moral leader with unimpeachable moral authority. And I said, well, he's got to be Common.
What?
Yeah, so that's totally modeled on your flow. I mean, and so that was, to me, George Washington was like John Legend singing and Common's flow, like mashed together.
Wow.
And so you're very much a part of the creation of that. You were very much on my mind.
Damn.
And then...
I know I don't resemble George that much, but I'll take that, man.
And you know, then Tommy Kail elevated that to a principle with the casting of the show. You know, it was we want the artist, we want this to look like our country does now, and we want it to be the voices that you had in your head, and so that's why it looks the way it does, and it tells the story it tells.
But how did you know, like, that you had a voice that deserved to be heard? Because that was something important that was the first thing that I felt hip-hop gave me. And I'm saying, like, when did you recognize that, and how did you know, like, man, I got a voice, my voice deserves to be heard somewhere?
Yeah, well, I mean, we were talking about this backstage, right? Who are the heroes that give you permission to write? You know, for me, it was seeing Rent. It was the first time I'd seen a musical that took place in the present. Because remember, I'm a New York kid, but Chorus Line is a period piece by the time I'm grown up in the 80s, and so is West Side Story. So I was like, oh, this takes place in the village. Now, like, you're allowed to write musicals about now. Oh my God, let's go. But then also those classic hip-hop albums. You know, for me, when I heard the Far Side's album for the first time, when I heard Passing Me By, I was like, oh, I'm allowed to write a hip-hop song, because I can't get any girls to notice me over here. So that was, you know, that gave me tacit permission. But, you know, when I think about your work and I think of waiting for the Lord to rise, I look into my daughter's eyes and realize I'm going to learn through her. The Messiah might even return through her. If I'm going to do it, I'm going to change the world through her. That's this man right here.
Good thing. Good thing. Good thing.
So what about you? You know, I had the good fortune of getting to hear snippets of your latest album before it came out, and it's so relevant, and it so speaks to the times we're in. What was the process of making that, and does your activism bleed into your work, and where do you see your responsibility in that respect? Yeah,
well, the project that Lynn is talking about is called Black America Again, and it just so happened, like, one day I was in sound check, and an artist I work with was talking about Sandra Bland. And for some reason, I just started thinking about Sandra Bland and was like, this is a human being who was a sister, a daughter, and we talk about her and we hashtag and we protest for her, but her life in the physical form is gone. And it kind of hit me on an emotional level, and I was thinking how repeatedly Black life had been removed from this earth just for being Black. And that's why I came with this thought of Black America Again. But I'm a hopeful person, so as I kept writing it, I started to say Black America Again is us rewriting the story. And that's why I started off, here we go again. Trayvon will never get to be an older man. Black children, they childhood stole from them, robbed of our names and our language, stole again. Who stole the soul from Black folk? Same man that stole the land from Chief Black Smoke and made the whip crackle on our back slow, made us go through the back door and raffle Black bodies on the slave blocks. Now,
I told you there's going to be a rap concert tonight. Speak on it.
Okay, this voice and stuff, it started from us being on the block, and when I knew that it was relevant was when I was rapping, and like you said, I found hip-hop to be something relative to my life. I was like, wow, that's me, you know, looking at Rakim, looking at Run DMC,
Yes,
looking at KRS-One and Big Daddy Kane. So I was like, I started expressing myself, and I realized that the voice could be turned into activism when I had people come up to me in my shows. I did a song called Retrospect for Life with Lauryn Hill, and it was about abortion. It was my story. But I had a gentleman come up to me and say, you know, Common, man, I decided to have my child because I heard that song. I decided not to have an abortion. And it kind of shook me. I was like, whoa, like this is for real. Like I'm thinking I'm rapping songs and just like rapping songs to entertain, and I'm doing it because I want to be dope. But it was like, no, this stuff affects lives. And then right after that, I had two guys that were gay that came to me at a show and said, yo, Common, when you use this word, it makes us feel disrespected, and we love you. And those two incidents changed the way I looked at what I would do with rap. Because I already was speaking from my heart and growing as an adult. But once I realized that the music does affect lives and the art affects lives and our voices mean something, that's when I was like, okay, this is a part of activism. But one thing I have to say, Lynn, and I see you doing it in many ways, when does the art, when do you take from the art and start really being an activist? Because I see you now, what you're doing for Puerto Rico, what you've done, the way you speak out, that's activism. Like,
Yeah.
That's not just only the art. So when does that?
Well, I mean, it gets back to something you said just now, which is writing from a place of love and being a hopeful person. You can use any source of fuel to power your craft, right? Rage is a fuel source. Joy is a fuel source. Anger is a fuel source. Love is a fuel source. I find that love burns slower and longer. I need it to write musicals. They take a long time. You know, Hamilton took me about 7 years, and The Heights took me about 7 years. I can't write a musical on rage. I could write like 3 angry tweets on rage. But I can't sustain that energy. That's the kind of fuel that blows up the ship. I feel worse at the end of the day. I'm too exhausted to go on. I need to write from a place of love. When I started writing Almost Like Praying, it was before there was any government response to Puerto Rico. It was just the hurricane hit Wednesday night, and Thursday, no one had heard from anyone on the island. And my social media feed and my emails and my texts were, has anyone heard from Isabela? Has anyone heard from Vega Alta? Is there a power in San Juan yet? And it was this terrible silence that we experienced on this side in the mainland, anyone who had friends or family on the island. So and again, art's how we enter the world. Yeah. That's just how we, that's our way in. So I started writing, all right, let me see if I can put every town into a lyric. If I can get all 78 towns in, pull up Wikipedia, check it against the tourism site, make sure I got all 78, and start writing this song. We use it for relief efforts right away. So this is before there was even a response. It was just when we were waiting to hear word. I wanted to fill the silence with music. I think most composers or songwriters you find want to fill the silence with music. And so I wrote it as fast as I could the day after the storm hit. And then I just called up every famous Latino person I know, and I tweeted the ones I didn't know. And everyone, to their credit, said yes, because everyone was looking to do something. Yeah. Everyone was looking to help. And so I said, where are you? And we flew to LA, and we flew to Miami, and we got it turned around in about 2 weeks. And 100% of the proceeds go to relief efforts in Puerto Rico. And yeah, thank you. So it's actually a classic example of when art meets a need to do something, because, that's going to be my first impulse always, is to write.
That's it. That's the important piece, what you're talking about, is because as artists, we, sometimes really want to do something. I remember Ambassador Andrew Young at our first rehearsal at Selma. He said, what are you willing to die for? Live for that. And he said, we were willing to die for freedom. We were willing to die for justice and equality, so we live for it every day. And when he said that, it was like, I went home that night like, okay, I got my foundation, I speak to the kids, I do things, but am I really living like to the title of activist? And it made me want to do more, but part of the element that I said was an important piece is sometimes as artists, we don't know where to go. We had a great meeting with our great President Obama one time, and there was a bunch of artists sitting around, and we were brainstorming on ideas and just trying to get some direction. And Talib Kweli said something that was very important, that he said, man, we got to be politically educated. And that was just that's one component that I feel like as artists that we had to find. But another piece that you brought up that was super important was that it's connecting with people. Recently, I did a song called Letter to the Free for the documentary 13th, Ava DuVernay's documentary. And I was like, man, if I'm rapping about mass incarceration, I got to do something.
Yeah.
I got to do something. I can't just be like rapping about it and talking about it. I got to be on the front line doing something. Well, for 10 years, a gentleman named Scott Butnick had been coming to me telling me I need to be up in the prisons and I need to connect with, he had brought formerly incarcerated people to our shows. All these years, I wasn't like engaged in it. But at this time, it just happened as divine timing when everything opened up. When I found out mass incarceration was also affecting young people in our inner cities of Chicago and everywhere, because when you take the father away from the family, then it becomes a cycle. So when I started realizing it was touching home in that way also, I just connected with Scott Butnick of ARC. And we went into prisons in California just recently and sat down with inmates, and I had some of the most enlightened conversations I ever had. We went back and performed, and then had a concert at the Capitol of California with 30,000 people. J. Cole performed Andrew Day, and we went the next day and became part of the policy change by helping these bills, SB 394, which is getting juveniles to no longer be on life without parole. I'm bringing this up only to say my gateway into that, my entryway was just connecting with somebody who was already doing the work. Sometimes, I think we, from our own seats, think that we got to come up with the solution and come up with all the answers. I think it starts with the desire and the passion. And when you seek that out, you take one step, God take 2 steps towards you. So then you go for it, boom. Yo, I was right there with Scott, and now we moving it, right, Scott? We moving it. Let's go.
That's incredible. Yeah, no, and I think, we're here talking about civic engagement. That's why we're here. That's why we're at the summit. And it's the root of all the other things, to be engaged, to be aware. People ask me about the political ramifications of Hamilton. I think if there's any political takeaway, it's, the limit of our representative democracy is that we get to choose who goes in the room where it happens. We don't get to say what they do in there. But we get to say who goes in that room. And that's the beginning of it. That's being engaged, getting to the ballot box, voting, but also being engaged in the issues and being engaged with the people who are really on the front lines of those issues. Yeah. So that's such an important part of the conversation.
Yeah, and I know so many of us become discouraged in many ways, but it's like, man, once I started realizing we can affect things on the state and local level and just from the grassroots perspective, like some of the biggest changes I've seen in my communities that come from grassroots things. And for a long time, honestly, I wasn't like a believer in the political sphere in that way, but, certain things brought hope to my life, and that was obviously us having President Obama. That changed my perspective a lot in ways and how I wanted to participate in politics. But it's so many levels that we can contribute to our country's progress and to people's progress and to the world's progress. So it's like, man, whatever level you choose, wherever you sit from, you don't have to be an athlete, you don't have to be a world-renowned playwright that's changing the world. An actor.
Totally, and to piggyback on that, with Puerto Rico and the work we've been doing, some of the most important work didn't cost a penny. It was people jumping up and shouting. It was, hey, there's a 70-year-old law called the Jones Act, and we can't get the supplies where they need to go. And David Begnaud from CBS pointing at the supplies saying, this is getting to the people, and everyone screaming about that until they waived the Jones Act. It was us screaming about whitefish and a company with 2 employees being given a $300 million contract. Everyone jumped up and down and screamed, and they canceled the So it is about, our voices can affect change. If you don't have $1 to spend, you can make your voice heard and make an enormous difference, because frankly, that's what we have. That's what we have, and there's enormous power in the plurality of our voices.
Okay, so we only have like a little bit of time. Why don't you start it off with a freestyle or something?
Oh, good
Come
gracious.
on, man. Give him something. Come on, Lin. Give him something, man.
Oh my gosh. With this squad sitting here uptight with the Chi-Town God. All right, it's Lin again. Sweeter than cinnamon, sitting with C-O-double-M-O-N.
C-O-double-M. I said it before. Like Rakim, yo, I came through the door. Thinking there's something that was hardcore, I'm jamming them. I told y'all before I was inspired by Hamilton. He said, common sense keep coming on. He said I was the new form of the George Washington. Woo! And that's how it is. We got biz. You know what time it is. Yo, common sense, the rhyme whiz. I passed it to my man Lin so we could say it again. Manuel, check it out, we jam well. I come from the south side where people be outside hanging. Back then, we used to be down with the gang banging, but now things is changing, making it even better. So Lin, put some more rhymes together.
Woo! Damn. I don't know how he do it. He really keep it fluid. I'm trying to learn from it here at this Obama summit. But I've become it. It's amazing. What the hell?
Hey, ain't no stopping. Ain't no stopping. We still hip-hopping. This man doing hip-hop and Mary Poppins.
Yeah. Okay, Common.
Y'all don't know, he in the movie, he in the Mary Poppins movie coming out. That's why I said that.
And Common is in every other thing you are watching on television and movies. And he is shy of, you're shy of a Tony, and I am shy of an Oscar, so we'll work on something backstage
we work
for
on
y'all.
something together.
Thank you so much for coming out.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah.
That was epic. I mean, epic. Unbelievable. Our next speaker is the kind of person who really believes in the power of just everyday people showing up to solve problems. She took one of our country's most seemingly irretractable problems of having over 100,000 foster kids waiting to be adopted, and she began to work on that problem and began to solve it. Please welcome the pioneering advocate, founder of Generations of Hope, Dr. Brenda Ehart.
I'm going to set the stage for you. It was 1982, and the crack cocaine epidemic was tearing families apart. Children were pouring into the foster care system. I was a researcher at the University of Illinois, and I was studying families who wanted to adopt some of these children. At the end of our 3-year study, most of the kids were back in the system. Now for my story. It began 2 years into our project. I received a phone call from one of the families telling me that their beloved Sammy had been met by a stranger, a social worker, after school, removed from their family, and taken to another foster home, to more strangers. Sammy was terrified. He didn't know what was happening. He thought he was going to be adopted and wanted to be adopted by this first family that called me. He was screaming, "I don't want to go. Please don't take me. Please." Sammy was 7 years old. My daughter was 7 years old. They were born on the same day. All I could think about was if this had happened to my Sarah. It was unthinkable. And I knew then and there I had to do something other than just be a professor. I had to do something to try to change this system. It was child abuse by the system, not by parents and families, by the system. And I thought about the families in our study, and they just did not have the support to parent these children with their troubled pasts. And so I imagined having 12 families live beside each other, each one committing to adopt up to 4 children from the foster care system. Many of these kids were part of sibling groups. and they'd be there to support and learn from each other. That meant I had to start finding housing. I knew nothing about housing. I eventually found it on a military base that was slated to close a year later. The Pentagon told me, "You can't have 12 houses, Brenda. We're dividing this base into subdivisions, and you're going to have to take 80 housing units." Then they told me, "We have no rules for negotiating with a nonprofit." I had started a nonprofit. All I could do was think of Sammy's face, and they were not going to stop me. Little did I know. So I had found the housing. I didn't know what to do about the issue of the housing. And so I heard about a program where college students were living in the homes of older adults for reduced housing costs. They were providing companionship and doing household chores. That allowed the seniors to remain in their homes. It was a win-win. I turned that idea around in my mind, and it was an aha moment. I said, that's what I'll do with the housing that we don't use for our families. We'll put older adults in it, and they'll get reduced housing costs for providing support to our families and children, for being grandmas and grandpas. But then there was the issue of the Pentagon, and they're negotiating with me. They were mighty stubborn, and they kept saying, "We don't have the rules. The rules are the rules." I had placed over a year's time, this is the truth, 1,000 phone calls to them, and they still wouldn't budge. It was 1 week before the base was to close. And its housing director said to me, "There's one more thing you can do." "What's that?" She said, "Send off a presidential inquiry." I didn't know what that was. 3 hours later, I was sending a very brief fax, that's what we did back then, to then President Clinton, asking him if he couldn't please intervene, please make it possible for us to negotiate. To my complete and utter amazement, 6 days later, 1 day before the base was to close, I was in a room with 7 men from the Pentagon. They told me that we could have the 80 housing units for $225,000. The state of Illinois had given us $1 million for this project, and so we said yes. And then, that was only preparation for the real work, which was to begin. Families and seniors began to move into Hope Meadows, the name we used for our little subdivision. And one of the first children from foster care to move there was Kenny, who was as cute as a button, 5 years old, severely neglected. He did not have a sense of self. I had never seen anything like this. He could not use a personal pronoun. He couldn't say the words I, mine, my. And when we asked him to draw a picture of himself, he would draw a stick picture, the line for the body, the arms, the legs. He never could put a circle on top for his head. He was really troubled, and he'd run away a lot. Thank goodness Grandpa Al lived next door to him and always seemed to know where to find him. And he would listen to him, and eventually they'd walk back home together again. Fast forward to Kenny's senior year in high school. He'd finally learned to read with the help of some retired school teachers who'd moved to Hope. And he was reading to Grandpa Al a lot. Grandpa Al had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. But Al was still saying to me, as he had for many years, I am here for the children. And Kenny was now saying to me, I'm here for Grandpa Al. Who was helping whom? And I'm always asked, do the kids graduate from high school? Well, yes. Do the kids go on to college? Many of them do, some don't. Some have graduated from some very prestigious schools. Do they have jobs? Most of them do. But here's the thing. What's most important to me is that these kids have grown into young adults who are masters of care, kindness, and compassion. Every one of you in this room would be lucky if they were your neighbor. And why not? They spent the time that they spent at Hope Meadows growing up, every day they were surrounded by acts of care by their neighbors, regardless of race, regardless of income, and believe it or not, regardless of their neighbors' political beliefs. If you can imagine this neighborhood, there were ordinary people, as President Obama said yesterday, doing extraordinary things, being there for this specific reason, to help solve some of our most intractable social problems. In this case, foster care. And there were vulnerable children who were thought of as assets, as contributing, as Kenny did, not as problems to be managed. And there were a lot of older adults who, instead of thinking of themselves as being used up, had a life full and rich with meaning and purpose. We call this, the basis of this community, intentional neighboring. And now we have those leaders are starting to apply this to communities they're developing. And they're applying this to not only kids in foster care, but to young adults with disabilities in the state of Washington and immigrant families. In Wisconsin, they're wrapping an intergenerational community around people with dementia. And we have a fabulous program in in New Orleans, for the young men and women coming back from military duty. And Vietnam vets and others are moving there to support them. The people who live there are beginning to echo the words of Miss Irene, a beloved senior at Hope Meadows. She said once, and now she's in her 90s, I feel useful. I feel I have a purpose. When my life is over on earth, I know I've left something of value behind. You, the change agents of tomorrow, the leaders of tomorrow, wouldn't it be great if you could help the people you care about, the people you work with, be able to one day say those same words? Remember, I fought the Pentagon and won. I have to believe anything's possible. I hope you do too. Thank you. Oh, please.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Next up, it is a Nigerian entrepreneur who runs a leading media company that regularly engages over 30 million young people from across the African continent. Can we please welcome Adebola Williams?
Good evening. It's good to be here. President Barack, thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to not taking a selfie with you, but shaking you and hugging you and looking you straight in the eye for that photo. You see, Africa is a very exciting place to live as a young entrepreneur. In Nigeria, where I live, a very attractive place to build business. But it wasn't always like this. I was inspired, like Paulo, who we heard in the first session yesterday, to use the media to change the narratives in 2004. I mean, we all know the stories. Young people desperate to leave the country, United States for greener pastures, Italy for prostitution, advanced free forward on the internet, all of these negative stories. There was a pungent smell of helplessness. There was no talk of youth enterprise, no signs of youth engagement in politics. There was very little to be inspired by. In my travels across Africa, from Uganda to Somalia, from Ghana to Senegal, I found that many were faced with this common enemy, helplessness. Helplessness because we're mostly dependent on government, but these governments not dependable. When you have consistently seen careless display of incompetence by leaders, absence of empathy and concerns for citizens, and failure to execute important infrastructural projects, it is easy to feel hopeless. It is easy to feel like you don't have a chance to compete or collaborate with your contemporaries around the world. But in despair lies several opportunities, especially to be pioneers, especially to be great. When we were 18, two friends and I started an initiative to combat the helplessness directly. We formed a company called RED, a social business that inspires young Africans to take social and political action through the power of storytelling. You see, there is no one force stronger and more powerful than an inspired, empowered human being. Likewise, there is nothing more dangerous than a human who is hopeless. He is a ticking time bomb with nothing to live for because he sees no value in himself. What we wanted to do was to build a critical mass of young, hopeful people who believe in the power of their own gifts to create a different future. The currency of this generation is talent, and President Barack and Michelle Obama believe in that, and that is why they've gathered us here today. In our work, the focus has been to build a critical mass of active citizens who believe we deserve more and will challenge systems, uproot oppositions, find and ultimately become the leaders that we desire. Case in point, 5 years ago, we led against the National Assembly of Nigeria a march called Enough is Enough, to demand that the then vice president be made acting president in the absence of our president who was ill, sick, we didn't know what it was, where he was. Merging pop culture with advocacy, a potent strategy to attract mass youth action, we moved to the city capital, Abuja, with top actors and musicians. This, of course, helped to attract many young people, but mainstream media didn't pay us any attention. But using the power of social, we tweeted Enough is Enough at such volume, it started trending all over the world. The entire slate of media we invited that ignored us started calling, from CNN to BBC, Al Jazeera to NTA. They all wanted in. That day, the government realized that there was a new generation of young people they had to negotiate with. But most importantly, the young people realized that we wielded a new kind of power. Immediately after the march, the president joined Facebook. And 1 year after that, he came from the city capital to Lagos to court young professionals. This was unprecedented. The next task for us was to build media we could control. So we set up whyniger.com, a premium youth perspective platform that gives citizens a voice. You see, I like to say that the media is the most powerful estate in the world. The media shapes The media defines our colors, our choices. It determines what brands you buy, where you live, what you do. It changes society from Bimbaka girls to take a knee to women now behind wheels in Saudi Arabia. Our daily thought at Y Niger is to teach a critical mass of young people to think, to act, and to grow. Media must drive agendas. Media must shape the conversation. Media must provoke action. And as we realize this, more questions arose. We asked ourselves, how do we help people get the governments they desire? How do we help people get the leaders they believe in or review systems they no longer wanted? To make progress on these questions, we needed to build a structure that is capable of influencing the caliber of leaders that we needed for our collective future. And that was how Statecraft, our nation-building company, was born. With Statecraft, we have been part of 3 successful elections, but the win is truly never about the candidate. It is the fact that the votes of the majorities counted. It is the fact that the voices of the people were heard. And when Nigeria did it, Ghana latched onto it. Now Kenya is tearing hard at it. I look around the continent now, and my heart beams with joy at the strides from enterprise to innovation, advocacy to governance, still growing economies, but Africa is woke. Finally, I have learned, and if we have learned anything in the last 2 days, it is that nothing can be more powerful, as Margaret Mead said, than a committed group, no matter the size. So, the task before us, we must continue to demand. The citizen must never stop demanding of those we have contracted to supply us governance, especially because we have seen the brightest or the hope bearers go to sleep soon as they get the power in their hands. To hold ourselves and our leaders accountable, hope is our weapon, media is our tool, and action is the remedy. The highest office in the land, ladies and gentlemen, is not the office of the president. The highest office of the land is that of the citizen. It is you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adebola. In the wake of Hurricane Maria, our next speaker fed more Puerto Ricans fresh, home-cooked meals more than any other relief organization. 2 million in total. And in his day job, he just runs, 26 award-winning restaurants and a food truck. Please welcome Jose Andres.
Hello, people of America, people of the world. My name is Jose Andres, and I am a cook. When I was a young boy in Spain, every summer my parents invited friends, and I always wanted to help my father to cook a big paella rice dish over an open fire. But my father instead put me in charge of gathering the wood and making the fire. But what I really wanted was to cook. One Sunday, after many years of making the fire, kind of my frustration exploded. I want to cook that. He told me, go away, we'll speak later. Well, after the meal was over, my father put his hand on my shoulder and said, son, what are you feeling bad about? Taking care of the fire is the most important thing. If you control the fire, then and only then, you become a cook. I became a cook thanks to my father showing me how to control that fire. Find your fire. And then, only then, you can change the world. Oh yeah. That's what we did at DC Central Kitchen 25 years ago when I joined as a young volunteer, peeling potatoes with the homeless, ex-convicts, ex-drug addicts, and sharing stories while feeding thousands each day. That's the power of food to change our world. My hero, Robert Egger, the founder of DC Central Kitchen, always told me, too often charity is about the redemption of the giver, not the liberation of the receiver. We need to change that, and we are changing that right here in this room. These words very much were on my mind when I first visited Haiti, weeks after the earthquake, and again after hurricanes, one after the other. I show up only with one simple intention, to feed people, but more important, I show up ready to learn. I landed in San Juan 4 days after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico. And I'm gonna tell you, you know it by the news, our fellow citizens really had no electricity, no cell signal, no gasoline, no fuel, no diesel. But even more critically, they had no clean water and no food. And I was kind of not able to figure out who was supposed to do this job, to feed the people. I knocked on the doors of the government and NGOs, and everybody told me, Jose, relax. We have it under control. They say they had decades of experience, and yet the American people of Puerto Rico were hungry and thirsty. So I called some Puerto Rican chefs right there, many friends with different expertise. As others were planning and meeting, we started cooking. We started with sancocho, a Puerto Rican hearty soup, at Chef Jose Enrique's restaurant in San Juan, where the roof was leaking. We prepared and delivered 1,000 meals the first day. A week later, 25,000 people per day. We were responding as quickly as we could to the need. Hospitals, elderly homes kept knocking on our doors, and we couldn't say no. We didn't even know how to pay for everything, but the need was more important than the how. The movement became Chefs for Puerto Rico, and we became an army of hope, one plate at a time. Our Delta Force were volunteers, our Humvees were food trucks, our guns were giant paella pans, our satellites were social media and radio. While other people still were planning, we kept cooking. Sometimes plans get in the way. Sitting and talking sometimes is not a solution. In the urgency of now, you act first and adapt as you go. When I first flew down to Puerto Rico, I only expected to spend a few days, cook a few meals, and go home. But there I saw the people willing to feed the people. So what do you do when life takes an unexpected turn? Don't follow no recipe. In 4 weeks, World Central Kitchen built the impossible dream. From a small restaurant, we went to 18 kitchens around the island. From 2 cooks, we ended with hundreds. From 10 food trucks, we ended with 7,000 volunteers, producing 150,000 meals a day. Someone you know ran a campaign spreading a message of hope and change. Let me tell you, it worked. Because hope and change is what we cook in Puerto Rico. And if a group of cooks and volunteers can do that, every one of you in this room can do that too. Oh yeah. The challenges we face today, hunger, poverty, inequality, war, have been around forever. But that doesn't mean it always has to be this way. We need you to come up with new solutions. And to do that, new recipes for success must be written. I want to leave you with this photo of these 2 girls, Rosella Angela and Yolaida, from an African community 1 hour away from San Juan in Loifa. They inspire me and they give me hope in humanity. Every day they show up for 3 weeks. They never ate, they never drank, they never had their apple until every single elderly person in their community was fed. These girls understand what it takes to change the world. Success at this point is less about your career plan, but more about finding your fire. our fire. Sometimes the urgency of now has a simple solution. Stop planning, make your fire, and start cooking one plate of food at a time. Thank you very much.
Welcome to Chicago. Let's do it one more time for Chicago. Over this next day and a half, we're going to explore together. We're going to share ideas. We're going to learn from one another. We're going to dig a little bit deeper. This is our chance. So let's go ahead and make the most of it.
For decades, we thought of citizenship as a possession. Now we remember that it is something you do, not something you hold.
We have to actually actively reinvest in our schools, our communities, and especially our libraries. But also we have to reinvest in each other. It is so much better to offer someone a handshake than to offer a click, a like, and a comment.
In my world of art, problems lead to opportunities. It should lead to action.
But the good news is it doesn't have to be this way. We don't just have to weather the storm of widespread economic insecurity. We can rewrite the rules of the game so that everybody wins.
What I've learned from living in Athens is that participation in a collective future is what nourishes us.
I get all of my passion, inspiration, and energy from young people. And it's an absolute joy and a privilege to meet the younger generation of change makers across the world who genuinely believe in the fact that they, as a single person and as a group and as a community and as a nation, not only can change their country, but can change the world as well.
Ordinary people in local communities can do extraordinary things when they're given a chance, when their voices are heard, when they come together, when they recognize themselves in each other. You are my co-collaborator, you are Michelle's co-collaborator in creating what ultimately the Obama Foundation will become. Thank you very much, everybody.
All right, give it up for day one. Just want to go over a couple of housekeeping notes before we go to our next speaker. I want to make sure to remind you to please join us for dinner right across the hall in Ballroom E. Jose Andres has worked with the Marriott team to prepare us a special Puerto Rican meal, and I want to make sure that yes, give him a round of applause for that. It's going to be amazing. I want to make sure that you head on over right after our last speaker. Next thing, just to remind you that the community event is going to begin tonight at 8:30, so please give yourself time to make your way there and also to take your seats. Our next speaker was born and raised in Stockton, California, and at the very young age of 26 became the first African American and youngest mayor of Stockton, California. Can we please welcome Michael Tubbs?
I absolutely hate the holiday of Halloween. And I have a sweet tooth. I know for many people, Halloween is about dressing up and trick-or-treating and being in community. But for me, 7 years ago, Halloween became synonymous with anger, with pain, with a sense of nihilism. November 1st, 2010 started like any other day. I was 20 years old, and I was so honored to be an intern in the Obama White House. So I woke up early, way too early for my taste, to make sure I got into the office on time, because Ms. Jarrett liked her clips bright and early. And while there, my mom has a tendency to text, call, and email me incessantly, but it was different when I was at the White House. She respected it. She said, you know what, I'll wait till you get home. And then I get a call from my mom. And I looked at it and I said, well, she would never call me at such an important job, so let me answer it. And my mom generally doesn't cry, but there was something different in her voice that day. It was barely above a whisper, and she had told me that my cousin Donnell James had been murdered at a house party in Stockton the night before. on Halloween. So in that moment, I was angry. I was upset. I had this sense of powerlessness and nihilism, and also a sense of futility. What was the point of being at Stanford or being at the White House when my own cousin was murdered back home in my hometown? Flying back to Stockton, the same feeling stuck with me. And then I realized that that narrative was not just a narrative of my family or my cousin, but of far too many young men of color and communities throughout this nation. Of far too many young men of color and communities throughout this nation. So going to the funeral, being upset, being angry, I sat down and had a conversation with my family and with God about where do we move from here? Because I think oftentimes when bad things happen, when things don't go our way, when everything's not perfect, it's easy to sit in anger. It's much more difficult to drive towards action. So I had a conversation with my mother. I said, Mom, how do we move from pain to purpose? There has to be a bigger lesson in here for the family in this. And she said, well, you have a couple options. You could continue on the path you're going and make a lot of money. So we had a conversation about whether it was more important for me at 20, 21 years old to make change or make dollars. And for some people, that's funny, but for us, it was real because we were poor and not doing much better now. So it was a real consideration. The second thing we had to consider, being 21 years old, coming of age in the time of social media, was this idea, was my fear of embarrassment greater than my love for the people? Meaning that if I decide to step up, decide to run for office, all my Facebook rants, and I didn't listen to the First Lady's advice then, so my Twitter rants at 20 years old, all those things will become public knowledge and political fodder. And oftentimes, when you put yourself out there as a public figure, you also make yourself a public target. So that's the second thing I had to consider. The third thing I had to consider came from one of my favorite sermons from Dr. King. He talked about the Good Samaritan parable, and he said the Good Samaritan was special because everyone else thought what would happen to them if they helped the man on the side of the road. And he said the Good Samaritan flipped that question and said, if I don't help, what happens to them? So the other folks were like, what would happen to me, my wants, my sacrifices? But the Good Samaritan said, what will happen to them if I don't help? And then the last kind of question I had to ask myself was this question of charity versus justice. Because at that time, I thought I was doing a lot of good things. I was running nonprofits, I was doing programs, I was speaking at fundraisers, I was doing all these charity things. And then after the death of my cousin and examining kind of the structural violence in communities throughout this nation that make it so young people oftentimes don't get the opportunity to sit where we sit, nor reach their full potential, necessitates something a little bit more in justice. So me and my friends had this debate, like, is it about charity or is it about justice? And I came to the conclusion that for me, charity is necessary, but it's not sufficient to create the world that we want to create. When kids are growing up in communities with limited opportunity, that some of us have to step up, get in the arena, and be like Solange and demand a seat at the table. So in 2012, at 21 years old, with no money, even less experience, I decided to be motivated by the death of my cousin and to run for city council in Stockton, California. Stockton's a city of 315,000 people. It has a lot of assets, but also, like many communities, had some real structural issues to deal with. And running wasn't easy. There was no guarantee that we would win. But now being in the room where it happens, like Lin-Manuel said, provides an opportunity to again put purpose to that pain and to articulate policy solutions that come not just from something I read, but from things I lived. And I share that because I know you all out there have that same lived experience, that same passion, and maybe you just need someone to tell you to run. So run. And 5 years later, so many things have happened in the great all-American city of Stockton, California. We're not perfect, Everything's not fixed, but in 5 years, by listening, we've been able to close down problem liquor stores and establish fresh produce for folks in my old neighborhood. In 5 years, we've been able to bring in the first bank to the underserved parts of the community in the last 50 years. In 5 years, we've been able to start and pilot a universal basic income demonstration, and now we're working on the college promise. And all this good work didn't just happen. It took people. It took someone stepping up and saying, you know what, I may not have any money, may not have all the answers, but I have a lot of anger, a lot of pain, and how to put purpose to that and do something with it. So I started 7 years ago, and I went in there. So after the death of my cousin and my internship in the White House, I was on another journey on the freedom rides with some of the original freedom riders. And one guy, Bob Singleton, he said 2 things that stuck with me that I want to leave with us, because I think they really speak to the point of this convening. The first thing Mr. Singleton said, and what was shocking, he was 20 years old when he got on that bus. And for some reason, maybe because I'm slow, I thought he was 70 when he got on the bus, and 70 again in 2010. And then I did the math, and he was actually 20. And he said he had a decision to make. He said there were a lot of great moments in the civil rights movement, but he said it took collective impact and collective power to change those moments into a movement. And he said, what are you going to do? And then he said, I was arrested on August 4th, 1961. Michael, why is that day important? And I said, well, you were arrested, and if you weren't arrested, I wouldn't be on this bus, and we wouldn't be having this 50-year reunion. And then he rolled his eyes, and he said something very powerful. He said, on that day, Barack Hussein Obama was born. And he said he had no idea, as a 20-year-old, with no power, less opportunity than we have now, with a wholly segregated system, the choice he made at 20 years old would pave the way so a child just being born will have the chance to be president 50 years later. And then he looked at me and left me with a question that motivates me every day, and I think should motivate all of us. The first one is, was this summit just a moment, or is it a catalyst to a global movement of reclaiming our time, our communities, and making our world look like what it should? And the final question is this: what are we prepared to do today so that 50 years from now, a child born on November 1st, 2017 has every opportunity we've had and even more? Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Michael. Our next guest is at the very center of the conversation about how media has changed and how it needs to change. Please welcome Tina Rosenberg.
Here's a new way to imagine journalism. 3 years ago, the major paper in Cleveland, The Plain Dealer, started work on a series about the intersection of lead paint, race, and poverty. Now, it wasn't the first time that The Plain Dealer had done such a series. In fact, this was the third such series in just the last few years. Those first two had established that Cleveland had one of the worst lead problems of any city in the country and documented in detail how badly the city had failed its children. So what was the fallout from those first series? Well, not much, actually. A lot of talk from politicians and a few minor reforms. So this time, The Plain Dealer did something different. Yes, they did the traditional investigative work about the problem, but they also asked another question: who's doing it better? This allowed them to report on what was going right in cities such as Rochester, Akron, Grand Rapids, to make it painfully clear that Cleveland had no excuses. The paper published a chart that said, here's what successful cities do, and here's what Cleveland does. And this time, their series has had a big effect. The city has greatly increased its budget and its staff for dealing with lead paint. It has adopted many of the best practices found elsewhere. For example, for the first time, Cleveland is proactively testing its school children for lead paint. So, what was it that created change in Cleveland? It was journalism holding local officials accountable by telling you better is possible, and here's what better actually looks like. I'm co-writer of the Fixes column in the New York Times, which looks every week at a different response to a social problem. I'm also co-founder of an organization called the Solutions Journalism Network, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. Now, most of us in this room are in the business of behavior change. We all know that simply pointing out someone's shortcomings is unlikely to get results. If you want me to change, I need to know that change is possible, what change looks like, and that people just like me have done it. And that is also what societies need. Journalists, however, tend not to cover what's working. Our job as journalists should be to hold a mirror up to society to help society change, but we are holding up a distorted mirror. Now, covering what's wrong has not always been our major focus. That really took place since Watergate and the Vietnam War. The switch back then to investigative reporting was healthy, because up till that point, journalists had given too many people in power a free pass. But since Watergate, the uncovering wrongdoing has become practically the only thing in our job description. Now, that pressure for change is very important. But as in Cleveland, people also need to know that better options are possible. In a country as big and diverse as ours, this should be pretty easy. Any problem that's widely shared has many different people working on it, and some of those responses are going to be more successful than others. Innovation is everywhere, but we don't know about it. Journalists should be like bees, cross-pollinating, highlighting innovation so that other people can take advantage of it. I'm not saying we don't need watchdog journalism. We certainly do, and now more than ever. But the definition needs to expand to also include rigorous reporting on potential solutions, if for no other reason than because if we feed society's sense of outrage every single day without also feeding society's sense of efficacy, we create passivity and despair. My own light bulb moment. I write a lot about public health, and I used to do it in the old-fashioned way. Here's how terrible things are. Back in the year 2000, I pitched my editor at the Sunday magazine of the New York Times on a story about the price of AIDS drugs in poor countries. Now, in countries where the AIDS burden was the highest, very, very few people could afford these life-saving drugs. That was widely known at the time. What was not widely known was why. Collusion between pharmaceutical manufacturers and Washington to put trade pressures on countries that sought to make or buy generic drugs. Okay, pretty good story, right? So I pitched it to my editor, and he said no. Too depressing. We cannot inflict another 7,000-word article on our readers about how everyone with AIDS is going to die in Malawi. So I went back and rethought it. There was one country that was defying this pressure from Washington, making generic antiretrovirals and providing them for free to all their people, and that was Brazil. So I turned the story inside out. I said everything I wanted to say about the bad behavior, but through the frame of what Brazil had to fight off in order to save its people. So this was a much better way of telling the story. It was fresh. Our readers did know that people with AIDS were going to die in Malawi. They did not know that those people were not dying in Brazil. This was a story about AIDS that made readers feel powerful and energetic rather than fatalistic and depressed. And it may have had some effect. It helped to shift the debate from, can poor countries treat HIV, to How can we do what Brazil is doing? That story will be on my gravestone. At the Solutions Journalism Network, we help news organizations do these kinds of stories. When we started 5 years ago, we got a lot of, oh, that's not real journalism. But we don't hear that anymore. We've worked with some 150 news organizations across the country, and we're starting to work internationally. Now, many journalists don't like writing negative story after negative story, any more than you like reading it. But they are scared to write about what works, lest it come out looking like advocacy or public relations. So our job is to show them how to do these kinds of stories with rigor and high journalistic standards. The Plain Dealer series, Toxic Neglect, is a great example of that. Another one is the Chattanooga Times Free Press in Tennessee, their series, The Poverty Puzzle, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. This series looked at how difficult economic and social mobility was. It was set in various places inside Chattanooga where people were trying to solve the problem, like a church, a school, social service agency. Now, the series was candid. Failure was much more common than success. But looking at what made the difference between success and failure and how desperately people were trying made readers cry and care and hope. The lead reporter on this series said she couldn't believe the civility of the Facebook comments. Journalists are accused of many different kinds of bias. But the most toxic is our bias towards negativity. This is something that has made many people in the United States stop trusting journalists. I recently asked a group of people in Alabama what they thought of mainstream media coverage of their state. And they said, "You guys always choose stories that make us look like ignorant yahoos." If someone comes to Chicago to cover communities of color, they will invariably be writing about poverty and crime. Now, these stories are not inaccurate. That isn't the problem. The problem, as we all know, is that they're not the whole story. People are more than their pathologies and stereotypes, and covering them through that lens robs them of their agency and blinds the rest of us to what communities are doing to actually solve their own problems. It's not just trust in the media that's declining. Trust in all American institutions has plummeted. In 1972, 46% of Americans surveyed agreed that most people can be trusted. By 2012, that number was down to 32%. And we especially don't trust people who don't look like we do. During the election campaign, we were told that crime was at record highs, even though at the time it was at near record lows. We were told to quake in fear of immigrants, even though they're more law-abiding than other people. People believe these statements because they fit with the picture of the world that we see every day in the media. We consume a steady diet of dysfunction, failure, and corruption. No wonder many people think the only thing we can do for our institutions is tear them down and start over again. We've been speaking for the last day and a half about how to engage more people in civic life. Imagine how engaging it would be if journalism was different. If alongside reporting on problems, journalism also told us true stories of people working together effectively to make measurable change. Imagine the intelligence this would unleash, the energy it could produce. Imagine if journalism told us, better is possible, and here's how. Thank you.
Our next speaker has dedicated his life to helping the poor, the condemned, and the incarcerated. He successfully argued several cases at the United States Supreme Court and just won a historic victory that ruling that mandatory life without parole sentences for those who are 17 years old or younger are unconstitutional. Please welcome Brian Stevenson.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm so thrilled to be here. This has been so exciting, so energizing, so affirming. Being with all of you in this room has been incredibly inspiring. And I am persuaded that we have the people in this space to change the world. And I'm really serious. I believe we can do it. I believe we can actually create some dynamics in the world that force things to change. And I know you've had a lot of wonderful things to put in your head and your heart, and it's been really powerful for me too. I just want to offer a short prescription as you go out and try to change the world, because you're going to get to moments where things feel difficult and challenging and overwhelming. You're going to have a lot of people in your ear telling you to go this way and that way, and I just want to offer you something. I believe if we want to change the world, there are 4 things we have to do. The first thing we have to do is that we've got to get proximate and stay proximate to the people we care about, the people we serve. We've got to get closer to the poor and the excluded, the disabled and the neglected. If we're trying to change how we deal with the problems of refugees and exiles, we've got to stay close to those who have been exiled and displaced. If we're trying to change how we deal with those who have been addicted and coming out of jails and prisons, we've got to get proximate to those communities. We cannot change the world if we stay at a distance from the problems we're trying to fix. And I say that because I really do believe that when you get proximate to people who are suffering and excluded, people who have been treated unfairly, you learn things that you cannot learn from a distance. When you're proximate, you hear things you can't hear from a distance. You see things you can't see from a distance. I believe there's power in proximity, and you can't wait until you have solutions before you choose to get proximate to those who are suffering. You've got to get proximate just as you are, and the solutions will come in that dynamic. And I've learned about this because my grandmother was the one who taught me about this. My grandmother was one of these amazing people. She was a classic African-American matriarch. She was tough. She was strong. She was loving. She was kind. She was the end of every argument in our family. She was also the start of a lot of arguments in our family. And when I was a little boy, my grandmother would come up to me and she'd give me these hugs and she'd squeeze me so tightly, I thought she was trying to hurt me. And then she'd see me an hour later and she'd see me and she'd say, "Brian, do you still feel me hugging you?" And if I said no, she would jump on me again. And by the time I was 10, my grandmother had taught me every time I would see her, I would say, "Mama, I always feel you hugging me." And she would smile this smile, and I didn't appreciate what she was doing until I got much older. And she was a domestic her whole life, and she fell, she broke her hip, she was dying. She was in her 90s, and I went to see my grandmother, and I was sitting there just pouring my heart out because I loved her. She was the daughter of enslaved people. She taught me so much about the world, and I was holding my hand, pouring my heart out, and I stood up to leave, and I didn't even think she was awake, but before I left, my grandmother squeezed my hand. And then she opened her eyes, and she looked at me, and she said, "Brian, do you still feel me hugging you?" And then she said, "I'm always going to be hugging you." And I didn't appreciate the power of that until I started working with death row prisoners, and I had to stand next to condemned people who were being wrongly convicted and tortured on death rows. I didn't understand the power of that until I held children, 14, sentenced to die in prison after they'd been abused and assaulted. I didn't appreciate the power of that until I got into difficult places. But what I realized is that we can all hug someone. We can get close enough to the people we serve and embrace them, and you should not doubt the power of what you can do by just holding on to the communities you love, the people you serve. There's power in proximity. I'm the product of someone's choice to get proximate. I'm not here because I'm special or smart or anything. I began my education in a colored school. In my community, black kids couldn't go to the public schools. There were no high schools for black kids when my dad was a teenager. He couldn't go to high school. And lawyers came into our community and they made them open up the public schools. And because those lawyers got proximate to poor black kids like me, I got to go to high school. I got to go to college. I was a philosophy major in college, couldn't figure out what to do. And I looked into graduate school in history and English and political science, and I didn't realize until I looked into it that you actually have to know something about history, English, and political science to get admitted to graduate school. So I kept looking, and to be honest, that's how I found my way to law school. It became very clear to me, you don't need to know anything to go to law school. You don't. So I signed up for that. But I was struggling in law school until I got proximate to condemned people, and it radicalized my interest in the law. And I'm telling you, there's power in proximity. Get close to the people that are suffering and excluded, the people we want to serve, and we'll find our power. But that's not the only thing we have to do. The second thing we've got to do, if we're going to change the world, we've got to change the narratives underneath the issues. We can win the debates, we can win some policy discussions, we can win some of these issues, but if we don't change the narrative, if we don't win the narrative struggle, those policies may not be sustained. There's a narrative underneath these issues. We have mass incarceration in America because we adopted this misguided war on drugs. We decided to put people who are drug dependent, people who are dealing with addiction, we said they're criminals. And we put them in our jails and prisons. We could have said there are people with medical issues and used our healthcare system to address that, but we didn't do that. And the reason why we didn't do that has to do with a narrative. The people in power were preaching what I call the politics of fear and anger. They wanted people in this country to be afraid and angry. And they used the politics of fear and anger to justify these policies. And I have to tell you that fear and anger are the essential ingredients of injustice. And no matter where you go in the world, you've got to find that narrative of fear and anger, and you've got to fight it. Go any place where there's oppression and abuse. If you ask the oppressors why they do what they do, they'll give you a narrative of fear and anger. And we've got to change that narrative. We've got to change the narrative about race in this country. I can't come to Chicago without talking about the burden that we still face in America. We're not really free in this country. We're not. We're burdened by a history of racial inequality. It's kind of a smog that's in the air, and we all breathe it in. And we've got to change the narrative of racial difference that we have inherited. Our parents should have done it, our grandparents should have done it, but no one's done it. We've got to do it. You've got to do it. We've got to talk about these things that we haven't talked about. We've got to talk about in this country the fact that we live in a post-genocide society. You see, that there were native people here before European settlers came, and we killed them by the millions through famine and war and disease. It was a genocide, but we didn't call it a genocide. We said, no, these native people, they're different. They're savages, and we use that narrative of racial difference to justify that violence. And that's the narrative that we relied on to sustain 2 centuries of slavery. And I don't think the great evil of American slavery was involuntary servitude or forced labor. I believe the real evil of American slavery was this narrative of racial difference, this ideology of white supremacy that we made up to legitimate the enslavement of black people. So, black people are different than white people. They can't do this, they can't do that. And that narrative of racial difference, that ideology of white supremacy, that was the true evil of American slavery. And if you read the 13th Amendment, it talks about ending involuntary servitude and ending forced labor, but it doesn't say anything about ending this narrative of racial difference. And because of that, I don't think slavery ended in 1865. I think it just evolved. It turned into decades where we had terrorism and black people were pulled out of their homes and burned and mutilated and tortured. And older people of color come up to me sometimes and say, Mr. Stevenson, I get angry when I hear somebody on TV talking about how we're dealing with domestic terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They said, we grew up with terror. We had to worry about being bombed and lynched and menaced every day of our lives. The black people that are here in Chicago, the black people that went to Detroit and Cleveland, Los Angeles and Oakland did not go to those communities as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities. They came to these communities as refugees and exiles from terror in the American South. And that narrative continued. We had a brilliant civil rights struggle in this country, but we won the passage of the law, the Voting Rights Act, and the Civil Rights, but we didn't win the narrative battle. And today, that narrative of racial difference still persists. And black boys and black girls have to overcome these presumptions of dangerousness and guilt. The Bureau of Justice predicts that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison. 1 in 6 Latino boys is expected to go to jail or prison. There is this presumption of dangerousness and guilt, and it doesn't matter whether you're a talented student at Stanford. It doesn't matter whether you're a Harvard professor. It doesn't even matter if you're the president of the United States. You've got to deal with burdens that other people don't have to deal with because your color is black or brown or red, and we've got to change the narrative of racial difference if we truly want to be free. And I think that means talking about these things. If you go to South Africa, you can't spend time there without seeing the legacy of apartheid. In Rwanda, they make you hear about the genocide. In Germany, you can't go 100 meters in Berlin without seeing markers and stones that have been placed next to the homes of Jewish families. The Germans want you to go to the Holocaust Memorial, but in this country, we don't talk about slavery. We don't talk about lynching. We don't talk about segregation. We don't talk about race. We don't talk about racial justice, and we've got to change that narrative. My project in Montgomery, we're putting markers at every lynching site in America. We're going to open a museum next April that you're all invited to. We've created this memorial to peace and justice, and I want you to all come because we're trying to change this narrative. We've got to do something about the narrative. Third, You can't change the world by just changing narratives and staying proximate. The third thing you've got to do is you've got to stay hopeful. And this has been such an encouraging and inspiring summit. I just want to enforce this idea that your hope is your superpower. Don't let anybody or anything make you hopeless. Hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. And your hope is your superpower. Hope is what will get you to stand up when other people say sit down. Hope is what will get you to speak when other people say be quiet. Your hope is your superpower. Hold on to it. Fight anybody that tries to take it away from you. It will help you change the world. And fourth and finally, if we're going to change the world, we got to stay hopeful. We got to get proximate. We got to change narratives. But the fourth thing we've got to be willing to do is we've got to be willing to do uncomfortable things. We cannot change the world if we're unwilling to do things that are inconvenient or uncomfortable. The president talked about it yesterday. We can't just be in the spaces where people affirm what we think and say we've got to go into spaces where people are pushing back. But our capacity to do the uncomfortable opens up the door to changing the world. I learned something about doing the uncomfortable. I'll end with this. I was giving a talk in a church, and this older black man came into the church. He was in a wheelchair. And he was sitting in the back, and he was staring at me with this stern, angry look on his face. I couldn't figure out, why is he looking at me like that? And he was just looking so intensely. It was kind of distracting me during my talk because he had this stern, angry look. And I got through the talk, and people came up. They were very nice and appropriate, but that older man kept sitting in the back. And when everybody else walked away, he wheeled himself to the front of the church. And when he got in front of me, he put his hand up. He said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I just stood there. And then he asked me again, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I stepped back and I mumbled something. And then he asked me one last time, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And then he looked at me, he said, "I'm going to tell you what you're doing." And that older black man looked at me and he said, "You're beating the drum for justice. You keep beating the drum for justice." And I was so moved. I was also really relieved because I just didn't know what was about to happen. And then this man grabbed me by my jacket. He pulled me into his wheelchair. He said, come here, I'm going to show you something." And he turned his head. He said, "You see this scar I have behind my right ear?" He said, "I got that scar in Greene County, Alabama, 1963, trying to register people to vote." He turned his head. He said, "You see this cut I have down here at the bottom of my neck? Got that cut in Philadelphia, Mississippi, 1964, trying to register people to vote." He turned his head. He said, "You see this dark spot?" He said, "That's my bruise. Got my bruise in Birmingham, Alabama, 1965, trying to register people to vote." He looked at me. He said, "I'm going to tell you something, young man." He said, "People look at me, they think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars." He said, "But I'm going to tell you something." He said, "These are not my cuts. They're not my bruises." He said, "These are not my scars." He said, "These are my medals of honor." And I think to honor what we've learned, to honor the energy of this space, to honor the legacy created by this summit, to honor the calling that we have all answered to change the world, we're going to have to be willing to do uncomfortable things. We're going to have to be willing to be that community of people that sometimes gets a little nicked and scarred, but we should know that we're not doing it alone. We are together in this. And if we get proximate, if we change narratives, if we stay hopeful, if we do uncomfortable things, I am persuaded that we really can change the world. And I just want to wish you the very best in that pursuit and to let you know that when you stand, I'm going to stand with you. I hope when I stand, you'll stand with me. When we each stand, we should wrap each other's arms around ourselves and let the world know that we are here for change. I wish you all the best. Thank you very much.
Wow. Well, it is official. Our time is coming to an end. But in the words of what our president said yesterday, this is really just the beginning. It is just the beginning. And there's only one person who could bring us to a close. Please welcome the 44th President of the United States, Barack Obama.
All right. Thank you. Everybody sit down. Sit down. We got work to do. Oh. We love you. Reverend Stevenson just gave us a sermon, so I don't want to try to compete against that. I've just got a few orders of business to do. The first is I want to acknowledge all the amazing presenters, both here on this big stage and in the workshops throughout the last couple of days. Can you please give them a big round of applause? Can you guys stand up? All our presenters, stand up. Just the presenters, just the presenters. Thank you. You guys were wonderful. All of you were wonderful. I also want to acknowledge the Obama Foundation staff, led by somebody who's been backstage the whole time with a headphone and has been working nonstop this entire time, Logan McClure, as well as my chief of staff, Anita Decker-Breckenridge, and all the team that has worked overtime to execute a cockamamie idea I had a few months ago. Please give them a big round of applause. They were fantastic. So some of you noticed I popped in and out of as many workshops as I could. And I tried to sit in the back and sit small. And sometimes people didn't notice me walking in, and sometimes they did. But I could not have been more inspired by what I saw and what I heard from all of you. I saw prominent world leaders and business people sitting on a floor next to a bunch of young people with Post-its on the wall, trying to design and plan how we were going to build a global cadre of young leaders that could support each other in their efforts at change. I heard from a pair of young women who had taken digital tools and automation in order to help young people in crises and to change laws all across this country in how we treat victims of rape and sexual assault. I saw artists who had decided it's not enough just to have a piece of work in a gallery. We're going to create public art that anybody can pull down, modify, change, work with in order to lead a movement and send a message. I watched some of you sit in circles, pair up, tell each other your stories, and then have the other person have to tell the group the story they just heard. And through this amazing alchemy, friends and relationships were created in a matter of moments. What I saw was the possibility of change. What I saw was the promise of a generation that is coming behind us. And so, when we set out to set up this summit, the goal was not to have solved every problem in a day and a half. It wasn't to give you a rigid curriculum, but rather we had confidence that if we just brought this many people together who are doing this many magnificent things, that they would teach each other and inspire each other and teach us how we could be helpful in the work that needs to be done. And on that front, I, for one, think it's been a success because you've inspired me and you've been inspiring to each other. Now, here's the only thing. This is the easy part. There was a wonderful workshop that paired up the activists of the past, although I noticed that they're all still active and vibrant and doing amazing things, with some of the activists of today and tomorrow. An intergenerational conversation. And one of the things that one of the panelists said about the current generation is, I'm worried that sometimes we feel that fierce urgency of now. We deeply want to be engaged in the pursuit of justice and equality and sustainability and all the things that have been discussed at this summit. But it feels sometimes like it's hard for us to keep our attention. Things move so fast. We get so much information. We're constantly checking. We're seeing what's next. And it becomes tough to sustain things. And I thought that was a useful insight, particularly because one of the other panelists was somebody who 50 years ago had worked in the civil rights movement. And it reminded me of something that I would tell my staff in the White House and that I would tell my team during campaigns, and that I myself had to learn when I was 23 or 24 or 25, and that is change is hard. Change is possible if we put our shoulder to the wheel, but it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen in one fell swoop. It requires sustained energy and focus and commitment, and most of all, it requires resilience. That's where hope comes in handy. People always misunderstood sometimes that slogan we used, hope, the audacity of hope. Hope does not mean that tomorrow everything's going to be better. Where hope comes in handy is when you've put everything you have into something and it hasn't worked yet. And it hasn't worked the week after that, and the week after that, and 6 months later, and a year later. And one of the most useful things about that intergenerational conversation is reminding people that something as basic as the civil rights movement in this country, and I'm not even talking about abolition, I'm not talking about Harriet Tubman, I'm talking about the civil rights movement within my generation. It took decades of legal work to get the seminal Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education to be heard before the Supreme Court, overturning the notion of separate and equal. That happened in 1954. It took another 10 years from that point for the Civil Rights Act to be passed, basically just giving the federal government tools to enforce what had already been decided was the law. Another year after that to get the Voting Rights Act passed. And then several decades after that to get to the point where you could actually see meaningful relief on the political front, not yet on the economic front, in terms of trying to heal some of the wounds that had arisen out of that tragic past. That's 20, 30 years, which to all of you seems like a mighty long time. But in the arc of history is yesterday. It's within my lifetime. So change is possible and actually can happen relative to human history incredibly fast today, but for each of you who are going to be out there working each and every day, it's going to feel sometimes like a really long time. And it's going to be hard. And the high that you get from this summit is going to, on occasion, dissipate. And I say that to you not to bring you down from the high that we're on, but rather to validate and fortify what you feel later so that you are reminded that when you go back home to your respective communities and you go back to your projects and efforts, you won't be alone because of this summit. Because everybody else in this room is going to be feeling some of those same frustrations, will occasionally feel a tinge of, why am I doing this? May have to talk to your parents or grandparents who say, why don't you go make some money? Or why do you keep on hitting your head against the wall? And that's all right. Because you've got a community of people, not just who are in this room, but who've been watching the proceedings here, who've been following what you've been doing, who've been taking a measure of hope from the successes you've had, who feel pain when you falter and are there to pick you up. And I'm one of those people. And if nothing else, I want you to take away from this summit that sense that you are right there, ready and able to transform the world. You know, my friend Lin was up here, who has written several magnificent plays, most recently Hamilton. That's the one that allowed him to pay a lot of bills. And he mentioned one of the hallmark songs of this production. For those of you who haven't heard about this, this has been first a Broadway sensation, then became a sort of a cultural sensation. And one of the songs is called The Room Where It Happens. Well, I've been in that room. I've been at the head of table of that room. And here's the secret I want all of you to know, is that most of the folks in that room are no more inherently qualified to decide what happens in this world than you are. They're not inherently better equipped to spread the kinds of values that I think are most important in how we treat each other. There are wonderful people sometimes in that room, but there are also people who are there because of luck, because of circumstance, because their daddy was so-and-so, because they were willing to do things or compromise their values in ways that most of us wouldn't. So you belong in that room too. Now, you don't get there right away. You don't get there automatically. And most importantly, if you do get in that room, it better be because you're there to represent and enable and empower those voices that you care so deeply about now. But you will get there as long as you're persistent, as long as you keep on believing, not just in yourself, but believing in the power of other people and your ability to connect and work with them. So, with that, it is my understanding that each of you have one of these cards in your seat. If you don't, it's stuck to the back of your pants. This is sort of a classic organizing tool that we used to use, Pluff. You remember these. And it's very simple. Sometimes you just want folks to make a commitment. The act of writing it down and handing it back somehow makes them feel like, I put it on a card. This is actually a commitment that you're going to be making, not to me, not to the foundation, but to each other and to yourselves. And it's very simple. On the back, it says, as part of my renewed and ongoing commitment to community engagement, I will, and then it's blank. And the last task before you get some outstanding Jose Andres supervised food, and before you hear an amazing concert at which our Chicago's own Common and Chance and others will be performing, is, no, you don't get to the fun part until you fill out this card. And you're going to turn it in. And it doesn't have to be, I'm going to, employ every low-income person in my country, or I'm going to, end mass incarceration. I would advise it be something that you will be able to accomplish. And it might be something as simple as you hosting a dinner with some folks who you haven't talked to before and need to hear from in order to broaden your circle of influence. It might be something as simple as, I've looked at my organization and I realize I need more women at the table because otherwise I'm going to be stupid. It might be that I am going to figure out how I'm going to get a workout in like Michelle told me to, so that I'm in for the long haul. But whatever it is, I want you to fill it out, and I want you to turn it back. And what's going to happen is we're going to collect these, and we're going to record them, not for me and not for the foundation, but for you, so that you are reminded of what it is that you think you need to be doing. And if it turns out that a week in, a month in, you're having problems meeting that commitment, it turns out you now have a massive support group from around the globe that will give you encouragement and support and advice and training and resources in order for you to be able to meet that commitment. Because ultimately, all the talk is fun and it's nice, but we're here to act. And in order to bring about the kinds of structural changes that we're looking for, in order for, as Anand pointed out, us not only to be throwing starfish back in the ocean, but us figuring out how they can stay in the ocean in the first place, we've got some big things we're going to have to do. And the good part is I'm confident that all of you are going to be able to do them. You could not have given us a better start to this process, and we have learned so much from all of you, and for that, we are all extraordinarily grateful. Thank you, everybody. God bless you. Go at it. Let's get to work. All right.
Ladies and gentlemen, please use the two side doors to make your way to the dinner reception.